Okay, that's quite smooth. Hi, I'm Alexandros Chiassos and today I'm going to share with you my rim brake bleeding routine and what I do to have the best brake feeling possible. So, as you may have noticed, I've paired the Magura HS33s with the GT Race Master cylinders and I can say that I've got all the braking power I need. However, being used to the disc brake feeling, I didn't like the lever feeling of my default setup and so I came up with a really nice trick that made my brake levers feel really smooth. But first things first, in order to start with the actual brake bleeding, I mount my bike on its stand so as to be able to move it around during the bleeding process to make sure that the brake lines are in such position to allow the bubbles to escape the system. Then I carefully remove the brake pad so as to avoid any contamination during the bleeding procedure, and given that each brake pad has been bedded in considering its position and orientation, it's not a good idea to mix them or reorient them. In case that something like that happens, your pads will have to get bedded in again after the bleeding process and you will lose temporarily some of your braking power. So one trick I have for you at that point is that every time I remove the brake pads from my bike, I place them on a piece of paper on which I've drawn a simple schematic of a bike so as to indicate the position and orientation of each brake pad. Next, the one thing I do every single time I bleed my brakes is to disassemble the master cylinders. I know that this means that I will lose all the brake fluid from the master cylinders and the bleeding process will be a bit more difficult, but stay with me and you will get my point in a while. So, as I told you before, I'm really used to the feeling of my disc brake levers, which is really smooth. However, when I got my GT Varial, I was a bit disappointed by the brake lever feeling of the stock Magura lever, and so I upgraded to the GT Race Master cylinders. But again, I didn't really like it, although I was amazed by the braking power. So I started experimenting with my setup and I found out that if I take apart the master cylinder and apply some silicone grease on the O-rings, the brake lever feels really great and it's very close to the smooth but snappy feeling of my disc brakes. Silicone grease is compatible with the standard O-ring materials and doesn't react with the mineral oil that is used on the Magura HS33s. You can find silicone grease on some hardware stores, or in my case I bought it from a supplier of underwater sports equipment. After reassembling the master cylinder, it's time for the actual bleeding of the hydraulic system, and to do that I use the Magura's Royal Blood, as I don't really think that water is good for the longevity of my system. However, in the future I would like to test the Trialtech water-based mineral oil alternative, but right now I'm pretty happy with my brakes. So, attaching the bleeding syringes on the relevant ports, I start bleeding the system. Please let me know if you want me to make a complete bleeding tutorial in the future, and in case that you have any question, please let me know in the comment section below. The bleeding process is complete when no bubbles are coming out of the system. But be careful to go gentle with the pressing and pulling of the syringes, as there is a slight possibility that air gets introduced again to your system via the connecting points. Also keep in mind that the syringes should not get pushed till their end, as there is the air that has been pulled out of the system, and if you get distracted, you may reintroduce this air into your system. Having finished with the bleeding process, it's time to check out the response of the slave cylinders. The slave cylinders should be able to move freely and simultaneously when the master cylinder lever is pressed. As you can see, I'm more than happy with the result of the bleeding outcome, and the lever feeling is really perfect. Now it's time to proceed with the bleeding of the front brake by following exactly the same process as before. Then, having finished everything, it's time to rebuild the bike, which is now ready for my next training session. Okay, that's it for today, and I would like to learn about your tips, tricks and hacks that allow you to optimally bleed and maintain your brakes. If you like this video, smash the like button, and in case that you're new to our channel, subscribe and hit the notifications bell so as to get notified every time I upload a new video. Also, if you think that this was helpful, feel free to share it with your friends. Finally, we can always be in touch by following me on social media. You can find the links to the relevant accounts in the description below. Thank you for watching and see you next time. Until then, make sure that your bikes are well maintained.